Well, good morning. Welcome to Community Church at Calvary Chapel Fellowship, located in Hurricane, West Virginia. I'm Pastor Cameron, and this is Sermons in 7, the Gospel of Mark. Well, today we find ourselves in the Gospel of Mark, chapter 8, verses 11 through 12. And that's right, we are going to be just looking at two short verses today and really just trying to hone in on what is applicable for us. How do we look at this? So let's just go ahead and read this today, and then we will get into this. But Mark chapter 8, verses 11 and 12 says, "Then the Pharisees came out and began to dispute with him, seeking from him a sign from heaven, testing him. But he sighed deeply in his spirit and said, 'Why does this generation seek a sign? Assuredly, I say to you, no sign will be given to this generation.'" Other accounts, other times that you hear Jesus say, "No sign will be given to this generation," in the other Gospels, usually it's accompanied with the phrase, "except the sign of Jonah." And and you wonder why Mark didn't add that here. And maybe a possibility is because, he hasn't really started talking about his death yet. Another possibility is because Mark is his primary audience is to Gentiles, and so maybe they wouldn't pick up on that. Maybe the Gentile audience wouldn't have picked up on what was going on with Jonah, they wouldn't have gotten that reference. But needless to say, he says here, "I say to you, no sign shall be given to this generation." And so what I want to do really quickly is just kind of go back to chapter 1 and look at the signs, if you will, that Jesus had already performed, that Jesus had already done, and that the Pharisees really should have been aware of. All right, so we start in chapter 1, and we see that Jesus overcomes temptation, right? Now, that was a personal thing. He was led away into the wilderness, so maybe people didn't really understand that or know that. Okay, moving on. But he heals people. He casts out unclean spirits. He heals Peter's mother-in-law. Many are healed after the Sabbath sunset. Right? He preaches, he forgives and heals a paralytic as we're moving into chapter 2. Right? He talks about being Lord of the Sabbath, about having authority over that day. He healed a bunch of people on the Sabbath. And then he starts talking about, he goes into the parables. The wind and the waves in chapter 4 obey Jesus. So he's showing these signs over victory over nature. And again, in chapter 5, we find a demon-possessed man healed, a girl restored to life, and a woman healed in chapter 5, verses 21 and beyond. He's rejected in his hometown. He sends out the 12 in chapter 6 with authority to do these things. You will receive, he gives them power pretty much to do what he's been doing. He feeds 5,000 people, or over 5,000 people in chapter 6. And then when we've been talking about, Jesus, he's walking on the water in chapter 6. And then chapter 7, we come to that he heals a woman's daughter who's possessed by a demon. He heals a deaf mute. And then chapter 8, which we've talked about, he feeds another 4,000 people. And then he comes to where we are in the Pharisees. So the Pharisees go out. And really, that was just to give you a little background as to the signs that Jesus has already accomplished, has already performed, right? So the Pharisees come out. Now, we've talked a little bit about the Pharisees. We said, they, on some level, before Jesus started rebuking them, on some level in history, they wanted to guard the law, right? They knew that, okay, all the exile happened because we forsook, right? We forsake the law. And so we want to make sure that no one ever does that. We're not going to do that anymore, right? But in trying to guard the law, Jesus says in chapter 7 that they were burdening people, right? That they were nullifying the word of God with their tradition. And so they were hindering people from coming to God. So the Pharisees, they come out. So that's who he's dealing with right now. They come out and they begin to what? Dispute him. Their desire is to dispute with him. Their desire is to test him, as it says. to dispute with him, seeking from him a sign from heaven, testing him. And so, have you been there? Maybe you're there. Maybe you've been there yourself. Maybe you have friends like that. They just want something from heaven because they're dealing with a situation. And they're like, Lord, just show me a sign. Just if you do this, if you do X, Y, and Z, then I'll do this, right? And you wonder, are you legitimately seeking something from God? Or, like the Pharisees, if he did perform a sign for you, would you reject it? Would you try to explain it away? Are you just trying to get more, ammunition so that you can launch it against him? So they're seeking a sign from him. Well, let's look, right? Let's look at a few Old Testament references. I'm not going to read them. I'm going to just talk about them as to what the Messiah would do. In Isaiah 35, 5 through 6, we see these things would happen, right? The Messiah would do these things, that the eyes of the blind would be open, the ears of the deaf would be unstopped, the lame would leap, the tongue of the mute would sing. As we trekked through this, guess what we saw? All these things happening. All these things happening. Maybe we didn't read the paralytic got up there, right? So the lame would walk. Isaiah 26:19, the dead shall live. Guess what happened? Jesus was raising the dead. Isaiah 61:1, good news to the poor. Jesus did that. And that was a passage he proclaimed about himself in Nazareth. But then he sighs, right? So Jesus has done all this. They should have known it. They should have seen it. But he sighs and says, you know what? No generation. He sighed deeply within his soul. And I think sometimes the Lord I don't know, why did he sigh? Probably because he knew their heart, that they wouldn't accept another sign. And so the question that I have for you today is, will you accept him? Is his word enough? Is his word enough? Accept him today.